I'm Margaret Whitmore, 28 years old, and 3 months ago I became the youngest widow from the Titanic disaster, while the world mourned the unsinkable ship. I discovered my husband Charles had been living a double life with assets worth over $2 million that his family now claims never existed. At his funeral, his brother actually whispered to me, "Women and children first was just for the ship, dear. The money stays with the men." That's when I realized my real battle wasn't surviving the Atlantic, it was surviving his family's greed. What they didn't know was that I had found Charles's private safe deposit box key sewn into my life jacket, and the documents inside would sink their plans faster than any iceberg. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pocket watch stopped at exactly 2:20 a.m. The moment the Titanic disappeared beneath the North Atlantic's frigid waters. I found it among Charles's personal effects when they finally returned them to me, 3 weeks after the memorial service. The gold case was tarnished with salt water, but the inscription inside remained clear. "To my beloved Charles, may time always be on our side. M.W." I had given it to him on our first wedding anniversary, never imagining it would become the final timekeeper of his life. That night replays in my mind constantly. April 14, 1912. We had been in our first-class stateroom when the ship struck the iceberg. Charles had been acting strangely all evening, pacing, checking his pocket constantly, writing frantically in a leather journal I'd never seen before. When I asked what was troubling him, he just kissed my forehead and said, "Nothing you need to worry about, my dear. Just business matters. Business matters." How naive I was then that the collision felt like nothing more than a gentle bump. I was reading Edith Wharton's Ethan Frome in bed, while Charles worked at the small writing desk. He looked up sharply, his face pale in the lamplight. "What was that?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, but something in his voice suggested he suspected more than he was letting on. He immediately went to the porthole, pressing his face against the glass. "Margaret, get dressed, quickly." "Charles, you're frightening me. Please, just do as I say." I had never heard that tone from him before. Urgent, almost desperate. As I dressed in my warmest clothes, I could hear commotion in the corridor outside. Voices, hurried footsteps, doors slamming. Charles was stuffing papers into his briefcase with shaking hands. "Margaret, I need you to listen to me very carefully. If something happens, nothing's going to happen," I interrupted, but even as I said it, I could feel the ship's deck beginning to tilt almost imperceptibly. "If something happens," he continued, gripping my shoulders, "you must remember that you are stronger than you know. You have your law degree from Radcliffe. You're brilliant. Don't let anyone, not anyone, tell you otherwise." The ship's band was playing somewhere above us, their music drifting down through the corridors, ragtime melodies that seemed absurdly cheerful given the growing sense of panic when the call came for women and children to the lifeboats. Charles made me promise to go. I refused at first. "I'm not leaving you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You have to," he said, pressing something into my hand, a small brass key. "Keep this safe. Hide it where no one will think to look." "What is it?" "Insurance," he said cryptically. "Promise me you'll keep it safe." I promised, though I didn't understand. In those final moments, I sewed the key into the lining of my life jacket with thread from my sewing kit. Charles kissed me one last time. "Remember what I told you about being strong," he whispered. "You're going to need it." Those were his last words to me. I was pulled into Lifeboat 6, and Charles went down with the ship. As we rowed away from the Titanic's lights, I watched everything I knew disappear into the darkness. The screams from the water still echo in my nightmares. But what I didn't know then was that Charles's death was only the beginning of my troubles. His family would prove to be far more dangerous than any iceberg. The Titanic's first-class passenger manifest listed Charles Whitmore as businessman, Boston, such a simple description for a man whose life, I would later discover, was anything but simple. I had met Charles 3 years earlier at a Harvard Law School reception in 1909. I had just graduated, one of only 12 women in my class, and was considering my options. Most of my female classmates were expected to marry and abandon their legal careers, but I had different plans. My father, a successful physician, had raised me to believe that women could achieve anything men could. Perhaps more so. Charles approached me at the reception while I was engaged in a heated debate with Professor Langdell about property law. He waited patiently until our conversation concluded, then introduced himself with a charming smile. "Miss Hartwell," he said, extending his hand, "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion. Your argument about women's property rights was fascinating." I was immediately suspicious. Most men, at these events, either ignored the female graduates entirely or patronized us with condescending praise. But Charles seemed genuinely interested in my legal opinions. "Mr. Whitmore," I replied, having heard his name mentioned among Boston's social elite. "I wasn't aware you had legal training." "Don't," he admitted. "But I have significant business interests that often intersect with property law. Perhaps you'd allow me to buy you dinner sometime. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on legal reform." Our courtship lasted 18 months. Charles was everything I thought I wanted. Intelligent, sophisticated, supportive of my career ambitions. He came from old Boston money, the kind of family whose name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. The Whitmores had made their fortune in shipping during the previous century. Charles told me, though he was transitioning the family business into steel and manufacturing, "The future is in industry," he would say during our long walks through Boston Common. "Shipping built our foundation, but steel will build our empire." I was impressed by his vision, his business acumen. He spoke knowledgeably about investments, market trends, and economic policy. When he proposed in the spring of 1910, I accepted without hesitation. Our wedding was held at Trinity Church in Copley Square, with 400 guests. The Whitmore family spared no expense: imported flowers, a full orchestra, champagne from France. My parents, comfortable but not wealthy, were somewhat overwhelmed by the opulence. "Are you certain about this, Margaret?" my mother asked the morning of the wedding. "The Whitmores are different from us." "Different how?" "They're very concerned with appearances," she said carefully. "With status and position. I worry you might find their world ... constraining." I dismissed her concerns. Charles had always been supportive of my legal career, encouraging me to continue practicing after our marriage. He seemed different from the other men in his social circle, more progressive, more open-minded, but there were signs, even then, that I chose to ignore. Charles was secretive about his business dealings. When I asked specific questions about his investments or his daily activities, he would deflect with charm and humor. His home office was always locked, and he carried the key with him constantly. When business associates called, he would step outside or into another room to take the calls. "It's nothing personal, darling," he would say when I mentioned his secretiveness. "Just boring business matters. I don't want to burden you with such tedious details." The Whitmore family fortune was also somewhat mysterious. They lived lavishly: the Beacon Hill mansion, the summer house in Newport, the staff of servants. But Charles never seemed to work regular hours. He would disappear for days at a time on business trips, returning with expensive gifts, but few details about his activities. Our lifestyle was luxurious beyond anything I had known. Charles insisted on the finest of everything: clothes from Paris, jewelry from Tiffany, furniture from Europe. When I expressed concern about the expense, he would laugh and say, "Money is meant to be spent, my dear. What's the use of having wealth if you don't enjoy it?" The Titanic voyage was meant to be our delayed honeymoon. We had been too busy with our respective careers to take a proper wedding trip, and Charles suggested we combine pleasure with business. He had meetings scheduled in London, he said, and then we would tour Europe together. "It will be perfect," he assured me. "The Titanic is the most luxurious ship ever built. We'll have the finest stateroom, the best service. It will be a trip to remember." Indeed it was, though not in the way either of us anticipated. Looking back now, I realize how carefully Charles had constructed his facade. The successful businessman, the loving husband, the progressive thinker who supported his wife's career. It was all performance, designed to hide whatever he was really doing with his time and money. But facades, like icebergs, are dangerous precisely because so much remains hidden beneath the surface. Charles's death certificate was a masterpiece of bureaucratic minimalism. Charles Edmund Whitmore, age 31, businessman, deceased April 15, 1912, aboard RMS Titanic. Estate value, approximately $15,000. $15,000, for a man who had spent more than that on my engagement ring alone. I stared at the document. In the law offices of Pemberton, Whitmore and Associates, the family's legal firm, 3 days after the memorial service, The Whitmores had held the service without consulting me. I discovered when I returned from New York after giving my survivor testimony to the press. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore," said the elderly lawyer, Harrison Pemberton, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "But the estate records are quite clear. Your late husband's assets were modest. I couldn't hide my disbelief. Mr. Pemberton, we lived in a 12-room house on Beacon Hill. Charles owned 3 automobiles. Our wedding alone cost more than what you're claiming his entire estate was worth." Pemberton cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The family properties belonged to the Whitmore Trust, established by Charles's grandfather. Your husband was merely a beneficiary, not an owner. Upon his death, his interest in the trust reverts to the family." I felt the ground shifting beneath me, much as it had on the Titanic's tilting deck. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying, Mrs. Whitmore, that your husband's personal estate consists of his clothing, personal effects, and a small bank account. The house, the automobiles, the investments, those belong to the family trust." Edmund Whitmore, Charles's older brother, had been sitting silently in the corner of the office. Now he spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. "We're not being unreasonable, Margaret," he said, his voice carrying the same Boston Brahmin accent as Charles, but without any of Charles's warmth. "You're welcome to remain in the house for a reasonable period while you adjust to your new circumstances." "My new circumstances?" "Well," Edmund continued, smoothing his perfectly groomed mustache, "you'll need to find employment, I imagine, perhaps teaching. I understand many widowed ladies find teaching quite suitable." Victoria Whitmore, Charles's sister, nodded sympathetically from her chair beside Edmund. She was 3 years older than me, unmarried, and had always treated me with barely concealed condescension. "It's actually quite liberating," Victoria said with false brightness. "You won't have the burden of managing a large household anymore. You can focus on simpler things." The rage that rose in my chest was unlike anything I had ever experienced. These people, Charles's own family, were sitting in their lawyer's office, calmly discussing my future as if I were a piece of furniture to be relocated. "I think there's been some mistake," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "Charles spoke frequently about his business investments, his properties." "Surely, Charles had a tendency to exaggerate," Edmund interrupted. "He liked to seem more successful than he actually was. It was a harmless vanity, really, but I'm afraid it may have given you unrealistic expectations." Pemberton shuffled through some papers on his desk. "There is, of course, the matter of Charles's debts. He owed approximately $8,000 to various creditors. The family trust will absorb these obligations out of respect for his memory." "But how generous," I said, my legal training finally kicking in through the shock. "May I see the trust documents and Charles's will?" The 3 of them exchanged glances. Edmund's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's not necessary," Pemberton said. "These are complex family financial arrangements. I'm sure you wouldn't want to burden yourself with such technical details." "Mr. Pemberton," I said, standing up, "I have a law degree from Radcliffe. I think I can manage to understand technical details." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Victoria's false smile disappeared entirely. "Margaret," Edmund said slowly, "I think you're upset, which is understandable. Perhaps we should continue this conversation when you're more composed." That's when he leaned forward and delivered the line that would haunt me for months. "Women and children first was just for the ship, dear. The money stays with the men." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. This man, Charles's brother, was using the tragedy that had killed his own sibling to threaten me. In that moment, I understood that my real fight for survival was just beginning. "I see," I said quietly, gathering my purse and gloves. "Well, gentlemen, Miss Whitmore, thank you for clarifying the family's position. I trust you won't mind if I seek a second legal opinion on these matters." "Of course not," Pemberton said quickly. "Though I should mention that most attorneys in Boston have professional relationships with this firm. You might find it difficult to obtain representation." I walked out of that office with my head held high, but inside I was reeling. Charles's family had clearly been planning this ambush since the moment they learned of his death. They had their strategy, their legal documents, their threats. What they didn't know was that I had something they didn't expect. The key Charles had pressed into my hand during those final moments on the Titanic. Whatever that key unlocked, I was beginning to suspect it would change everything. The Boston safe. Deposit and Trust Company occupied an imposing granite building on State Street, its brass nameplate polished to a mirror shine. I had walked past it dozens of times during my marriage to Charles, never imagining that it held the key to my future, literally, the small brass key Charles had pressed into my hand during those final moments aboard the Titanic had kept me awake. For 3 nights after the confrontation with his family, I had studied it under lamplight, turning it over in my fingers, wondering what door it might open. The number 247 was engraved on one side, along with the initials BSDT. It took me 2 days to work up the courage to visit the bank. What if I was wrong? What if the key opened nothing more than a small box containing Charles's cufflinks or personal mementos? But something in his desperate tone that night, the way he had called it insurance, suggested it was far more significant. The bank manager, a stern man named Mr. Aldrich, examined the key and my identification with professional skepticism. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I'll need to verify your authority to access this safe deposit box. Do you have documentation showing you as an authorized user?" I produced our marriage certificate and Charles's death certificate, my hands trembling slightly. "My husband died aboard the Titanic. I believe this key belongs to a box he maintained here." Aldrich's expression softened marginally. "Ah, yes. Terrible tragedy. Let me check our records." He disappeared into a back office, leaving me standing in the marble-floored lobby, surrounded by the whispered conversations of other customers conducting their private financial business. When he returned, his demeanor had changed completely. "Mrs. Whitmore, I do apologize for the delay. Yes, your husband maintained BOFTA 247 with us. According to our records, you are indeed listed as the designated heir with full access rights. Please follow me." The safe deposit box room was located in the basement, behind a massive steel door that required 2 keys to open. Aldrich's master key and my brass key. The room was lined with hundreds of small metal boxes, each representing someone's most precious secrets. BOFTA 247 was larger than I had expected, roughly the size of a small suitcase. When Aldrich turned both keys and pulled open the metal door, I gasped. The box was stuffed with documents, papers, and folders organized with Charles's characteristic precision. But what caught my attention immediately were the bank statements on top of the pile. The letterhead read First National Bank of Boston and showed an account balance of $847,000. $847,000 in Charles's name alone. "I'll leave you to examine the contents in private," Aldrich said tactfully. "Take all the time you need. Just ring this bell when you're finished." With shaking hands, I began to sort through the documents. What I discovered over the next 2 hours fundamentally altered my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my husband and his family. Charles hadn't just been wealthy, he had been extraordinarily wealthy. The bank statements showed multiple accounts across different banks, totaling over $2.3 million. There were stock certificates for companies I'd never heard him mention: Pennsylvania Steel Company, American Locomotive Works, General Electric, property deeds for 3 buildings in downtown Boston, 2 houses in Newport, and a factory in Pittsburgh. But it was the business partnership documents that made my blood run cold. Charles had been a full partner in Whitmore Industrial Holdings, the company that Edmund now ran. According to these papers, Charles owned a 45% stake in the business, worth approximately $800,000 based on the most recent valuation, the same business that Edmund had claimed belonged entirely to the family trust. I found copies of correspondence between Charles and various business associates, revealing the scope of his operations. He hadn't just been transitioning from shipping to steel, he had been building an industrial empire. There were contracts with the U.S. Navy for steel plating, agreements with railroad companies for locomotive parts, and licensing deals with European manufacturers. But the most damning documents were the ones involving his family. I found a series of letters between Charles and Edmund, dating back to 1910, that revealed a bitter dispute over the direction of the family business. Edmund wanted to maintain the traditional shipping focus, while Charles was pushing aggressively into industrial manufacturing. "Your reckless investments are threatening the family's financial stability," Edmund had written in one letter. "If you continue this course, we may have to take action to protect the family interests." Charles's response was equally heated. "The family interests are exactly what I'm protecting. Your refusal to modernize will bankrupt us within a decade. I won't let your short-sightedness destroy what our grandfather built." The final letter in the series was dated just 2 weeks before Charles and I departed for Europe. It was from the family's lawyer, Pemberton, addressed to Charles. After careful review of the family trust documents, we believe there are grounds to challenge your decision-making authority regarding business operations. The trust was established to protect family assets from individual mismanagement. We strongly advise you to reconsider your current course before we are forced to pursue legal remedies. I sat back in the small wooden chair, my mind reeling. Charles's family hadn't just been planning to cheat me out of my inheritance, they had been planning to remove Charles from the family business entirely. The Titanic disaster had simply solved their problem more permanently than they had anticipated. But there was more, hidden beneath the financial documents. I found Charles's personal journal, not the leather-bound book he had been writing in that final night, but a larger ledger where he had been documenting his growing suspicions about his family's activities. Entries painted a picture of a man who had begun to realize that his own family was conspiring against him. He had discovered discrepancies in the family trust accounts, evidence that Edmund and Victoria had been siphoning money for their personal use. He had been quietly gathering evidence, preparing for a legal confrontation. The final entry was dated April 10, 1912, 4 days before the Titanic sank. They mean to force me out entirely. Pemberton has been threatening legal action for months, and Edmund grows more hostile each day. I suspect they plan to use the trust documents to claim I've been acting beyond my authority. Margaret doesn't know any of this. I've tried to protect her from the family's ugliness, but if something happens to me, she'll need proof of what I've discovered. The evidence is all here, along with my personal assets. She's stronger than she knows, and she needs that strength to fight them. They underestimate her because she's a woman, but that will be their mistake. My brilliant, fierce Margaret will destroy them in court if they try to steal what belongs to her. I closed the journal, tears streaming down my face. Charles had known. He had known his family was planning to betray him, and he had prepared for the possibility of his death. The key he pressed into my hand that night wasn't just insurance, it was a weapon. I carefully packed all the documents into my bag, signed the necessary paperwork with Aldrich, and walked out of the bank with a new understanding of my situation. The Whitmore family thought they were dealing with a grieving widow who could be intimidated and cheated. They had no idea they were about to face a woman armed with the truth and the determination to use it. The war Edmund had declared was about to begin in earnest, and thanks to Charles's foresight, I held all the ammunition. The Whitmore family trust document was a labyrinth of legal language designed to confuse and intimidate. I spread the 23-page document across my kitchen table, armed with strong coffee and my best legal analysis skills, determined to understand exactly how Charles's family intended to rob me. The trust had been established in 1847 by Charles's great-grandfather, Cornelius Whitmore, ostensibly to preserve family wealth for future generations and protect against individual financial irresponsibility. What it actually did was create a legal mechanism for family control over individual members' assets. According to the trust provisions, any family member who engaged in financially reckless behavior or acted against the family's best interests could have their inheritance rights suspended by a majority vote of the surviving family trustees. The current trustees were Edmund, Victoria, and their elderly aunt Constance votes against whatever Charles might have wanted. But the most insidious clause was buried on page 17. Upon the death of a male family member, his widow shall receive a modest annual stipend for living expenses, provided she conducts herself in a manner befitting the Whitmore family reputation. Said stipend may be terminated at any time should the widow remarry, engage in unseemly public behavior, or pursue legal action against the family trust. They had me trapped in a Victorian-era cage. Accept their charity and live as their dependent, or fight back and lose everything. My second meeting with Harrison Pemberton confirmed their strategy. I had requested the meeting ostensibly to discuss the modest annual stipend mentioned in the trust document, but really to gauge how confident they were in their legal position. Pemberton received me in his oak-panelled office with the condescending courtesy reserved for poor relations and troublesome women. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm pleased you've decided to be reasonable about this situation. The family is prepared to offer you $2,000 annually, which should be quite sufficient for a lady of modest needs. $2,000, less than Charles and I had spent on wine in a typical month. That's very generous, I said carefully. But I'm curious about the terms. The trust document mentions certain behavioral expectations. Nothing onerous, Pemberton assured me. Simply that you conduct yourself as a respectable widow. No scandalous associations, no public embarrassments for the family name. Standard provisions, really? And if I were to seek legal advice about the trust arrangements, Pemberton's smile became decidedly cooler. Mrs. Whitmore, I would strongly advise against that course of action. The family has been extraordinarily generous in these circumstances. Many widows in your position receive nothing at all. Many widows in my position aren't married to men worth over $2 million. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Pemberton's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained carefully neutral. I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning, Mrs. Whitmore. As we discussed previously, your husband's estate was quite modest. Indeed, I said, standing to leave. Well, thank you for clarifying the family's position. I'll certainly give your offer careful consideration, but I had already made my decision. That afternoon, I walked into the offices of Murphy and Associates, one of the few law firms in Boston that didn't have professional relationships with Pemberton's firm. The brass nameplate by the door was smaller and less polished than the Whitmore family's lawyers, but something about the no-nonsense atmosphere appealed to me. The receptionist, a middle-aged Irish woman with kind eyes, looked up as I entered. "Can I help you, miss? I'd like to speak with an attorney about a family trust matter. It's rather urgent. Let me see if Mr. O'Brien is available." Seamus O'Brien was not what I had expected. Perhaps 40 years old, with thick dark hair and intelligent green eyes, he possessed none of the polished Boston Brahmin manner I was accustomed to from Charles's associates. His office was cramped but organized, law books stacked on every available surface. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, rising to shake my hand. "Please, have a seat. Bridget tells me you have a trust matter." "It's complicated," I began, then stopped. "Actually, before we proceed, I need to know, do you have any professional or business relationships with Pemberton, Whitmore and Associates?" O'Brien's laugh was genuinely amused. "Mrs. Whitmore, I can assure you that the gentleman at Pemberton, Whitmore would cross the street to avoid acknowledging my existence. We serve very different clienteles." "Different how?" "They represent old Boston money. I represent everyone else." His expression grew more serious. "What kind of trouble are you in with the Whitmore family?" Over the next hour, I told him everything. The meeting with Pemberton, the trust document, the family's claims about Charles's modest estate. I watched his expression grow increasingly grim as I described the terms they were offering. "They're trying to buy you off," he said finally. $2,000 a year, contingent on your good behavior, in exchange for waiving any claims against an estate they claim doesn't exist." "That's my assessment as well. But you believe there's more to the story?" I hesitated. I hadn't mentioned the safe deposit box or the documents I'd discovered. Something told me to hold that information in reserve until I knew I could trust him completely. "I have reason to believe my husband's estate was considerably larger than his family claims." "What kind of reason?" "The kind that would require investigation to prove." O'Brien leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to be direct with you. Taking on the Whitmore family legally would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially dangerous to your reputation. They have unlimited resources and decades of experience crushing people who challenge them. Are you prepared for that kind of fight?" "Mr. O'Brien," I said, meeting his gaze steadily, 3 months ago I survived the sinking of the Titanic. I watched 1,500 people die, including my husband. I was pulled from the North Atlantic after floating in a lifeboat for 18 hours. If I can survive that, I think I can handle the Whitmore family." For the first time since I'd entered his office, O'Brien smiled. "All right then. Let's discuss terms." Charles's personal diary was bound in chocolate brown leather, worn smooth from years of handling. I discovered it in my bedroom 3 days after meeting with Seamus O'Brien, tucked behind a loose board in the back of Charles's wardrobe, a hiding place I never would have found if I hadn't been packing his clothes for donation. Unlike the business journal I'd found in the safe deposit box, this diary contained Charles's private thoughts and fears. The entries dated back to our engagement in 1910, and reading them felt like discovering a stranger who happened to share my husband's handwriting. The early entries were filled with love and optimism about our future together. But as the months progressed, a darker pattern emerged. Charles had begun to suspect his family of financial impropriety almost from the moment we were married. October 15, 1910. Edmund questioned me again. Today about my decision to marry Margaret. Are you certain she's the right sort? He asked. When I demanded to know what he meant, he said something about keeping family business in the family. I'm beginning to think his concerns have less to do with Margaret's background and more to do with her intelligence. She asks good questions about things they'd prefer to keep hidden. December 3, 1910. Discovered discrepancies in the Newport property accounts. Edmund claims the house requires $15,000 annually in maintenance, but I can find receipts for less than half that amount. When I asked Victoria about it, she became evasive and changed the subject. Where is the rest of the money going? March 22, 1911. Pemberton mentioned casually that the family trust has significant liquidity issues, and suggested I consider reducing my business investments to support family obligations. This makes no sense. Our businesses are more profitable than they've ever been, unless someone has been siphoning funds for personal use. The entries became increasingly paranoid and detailed as Charles documented what appeared to be a systematic embezzlement scheme. Edmund and Victoria had been using family trust funds to support lavish personal expenses, while claiming the money was for legitimate family obligations. They had purchased properties in their own names using trust funds, taken unauthorized loans against family assets, and manipulated the accounting to hide their theft. But the most damning entry was dated just 1 week before we sailed on the Titanic, April 3, 1912. They mean to force me out entirely. I overheard Edmund and Victoria discussing removing Charles from decision-making before he destroys everything. Victoria actually said, if something were to happen to him, we could claim his business ventures were unauthorized and reclaim everything for the trust. The casual way she spoke about my potential death was chilling. I must protect Margaret from whatever they're planning. She doesn't understand how ruthless they can be. I closed the diary with trembling hands. Charles hadn't just suspected his family of theft, he had believed they were capable of far worse. And now, with him conveniently dead, they were implementing exactly the plan he had overheard. That afternoon, I brought the diary to O'Brien's office. He read through the relevant entries in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. This changes everything, he said finally. If your husband's suspicions were correct, we're not just dealing with inheritance fraud, we're looking at a decades-long embezzlement scheme. Can we prove it? The diary helps establish motive and opportunity, but we'll need more concrete evidence. Financial records, bank statements, property deeds. He looked up at me. Do you have access to any family financial documents? I hesitated, then decided to trust him completely. From my purse, I withdrew copies of the most damning documents from Charles's safe deposit box. O'Brien's reaction was immediate and gratifying. Sweet Mother of God, he breathed, examining the bank statements. Your husband was worth over $2 million. According to these documents, yes, and the family claims his estate was worth $15,000, approximately. O'Brien stood up and began pacing around his small office. Mrs. Whitmore, what you've uncovered here is fraud on a massive scale. If we can prove that the family deliberately concealed these assets while pressuring you to accept their settlement, what would that mean? Criminal charges, potentially, certainly a civil lawsuit that would expose their entire financial operation to scrutiny. He turned to face me. But I have to warn you, once we start down this path, there's no going back. They'll fight us with everything they have. Let them fight, I said. Charles trusted me with this information for a reason. O'Brien sat back down and pulled out a legal pad. All right, here's what we need to do. First, we gather every piece of evidence we can find about the family's financial activities. Second, we file preliminary injunctions to prevent them from disposing of any assets while the case is pending. Third, we prepare for the legal battle of the century. What about their threat to cut off my allowance if I pursue legal action? Margaret, he said, using my first name for the first time. If what these documents suggest is true, you don't need their allowance. You're one of the wealthiest women in Boston. Over the following weeks, O'Brien proved to be far more resourceful than his modest office suggested. Through his network of contacts, clerks, accountants, and other lawyers who served Boston's working class, he began gathering information about the Whitmore family's business dealings. What we discovered was astounding. The family trust, which was supposed to protect family assets, had become a personal slush fund for Edmund and Victoria. They had used trust money to purchase a yacht, a racing stable, and a mansion in Newport Hall, technically owned by the trust, but used exclusively for their personal pleasure. More significantly, they had been systematically undervaluing the family businesses in their reports to trust beneficiaries, while taking substantial salaries and bonuses for themselves. Charles's 45% stake in Whitmore Industrial Holdings, which they claimed was worth nothing, was actually generating over $100,000 annually in profits. "They've been robbing the trust for years," O'Brien explained during one of our strategy sessions. "Your husband was the only family member with enough business sense to understand what they were doing. His death was remarkably convenient for their purposes." "Are you suggesting they might have?" "I'm not suggesting anything," O'Brien said quickly. "Charles died in a maritime disaster, along with 1,500 other people, but I am saying that his death solved a very significant problem for Edmund and Victoria. As we prepared our case, I began to understand why Charles had been so secretive about his business dealings. He hadn't been hiding his success from me, he had been protecting me from his family's corruption." The diary made it clear that he had been planning his own legal action against Edmund and Victoria, gathering evidence of their embezzlement for months before his death. The key he had pressed into my hand during those final moments aboard the Titanic wasn't just access to his personal fortune, it was access to the evidence that would destroy his family's criminal enterprise. Charles had always told me I was stronger than I knew. Now, armed with the truth and a fierce determination for justice, I was about to prove him right. The forged partnership documents were masterworks of deception, so skillfully crafted that they had fooled banks, investors, and government regulators. For nearly 2 years, I discovered them in a manila envelope tucked behind a framed photograph in Edmund's office. I had no business being in, except that Victoria had foolishly given me a house key for emergencies before learning I intended to fight them. O'Brien had suggested the reconnaissance mission during one of our strategy sessions. "If they're hiding assets," he said, "there will be paperwork. Financial criminals are compulsive record keepers. They need to track their schemes to avoid getting caught in their own lies." The Whitmore mansion on Beacon Hill was empty on Tuesday afternoons. Edmund conducted business at his downtown office. Victoria attended her charity committee meetings, and the household staff had Wednesday as their half-day off. I let myself in through the servants' entrance, my heart pounding as I climbed the back stairs to Edmund's private study. The office was a shrine too. Whitmore family history oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, display cases filled with maritime artifacts, leather-bound ledgers dating back to the family's shipping origins. But hidden behind a photograph of the family's first steamship, I found documents that revealed the true scope of Edmund and Victoria's fraud. The forged partnership agreement was dated January 15, 1910, 6 months before Charles married me, and 2 years after he had actually become a partner in Whitmore Industrial Holdings. According to this version, Charles was merely a junior associate with no ownership stake in the company. His signature had been perfectly replicated, but I knew it was fake because Charles had a distinctive way of crossing his T's that this forger had missed. More damning were the accompanying letters, supposedly from Charles to various business associates, authorizing Edmund to assume full management control of all Whitmore family business interests. The letters were dated over a period of months in 1911, creating a paper trail that suggested Charles had voluntarily ceded his authority to his brother. But I had Charles's real correspondence from that period, and I knew he had been fighting Edmund's control every step of the way. These forged letters were meant to provide legal cover for Edmund's systematic theft of Charles's business interests. The most chilling document was a memorandum from Pemberton to Edmund, dated February 1912. The new partnership documents have been filed with the appropriate government offices and copies distributed to all relevant financial institutions. Should Charles discover the modifications and object, we can claim they were necessary corrections to reflect the true nature of his involvement in family business operations. The family trust provisions provide adequate legal justification for these actions. They had been planning to steal Charles's business interests for months before his death. The Titanic disaster had simply eliminated the need to deal with his objections. I photographed every document with the small camera O'Brien had given me for such situations, my hands shaking with a combination of fear and rage. These people's own family had built their future on the systematic destruction of his legacy. But their scheme was more complex than simple theft. As I continued searching through Edmund's files, I discovered evidence of a web of financial manipulation that stretched far beyond the family business. They had been using Charles's forged authorization to secure loans against family properties, then diverting the money to personal investments. They had sold family assets and pocketed the proceeds while claiming the sales were necessary to cover Charles's debts. They had even collected insurance payouts on properties that had never been damaged, using Charles's signature to file the fraudulent claims. The scope of their criminal enterprise was breathtaking. Over the course of 2 years, they had stolen nearly $400,000 from the family trust, while simultaneously destroying Charles's legal claim to his own business interests. But the document that made my blood run cold was a letter from Victoria to Edmund, dated April 10, 1912, the same day Charles and I sailed on the Titanic. Pemberton believes Charles has become suspicious of our arrangements. He's been asking too many questions about the trust, accounting, and demanding access to business records. If he continues this course, he could unravel everything we've built. Perhaps his upcoming trip will provide an opportunity for reflection on his priorities. Sometimes a change of perspective can be remarkably clarifying. The casual menace in Victoria's words was unmistakable. She was suggesting that Charles's death would solve their problems 4 days before the Titanic sank. Finished my search and left the house as quietly as I had entered, but my mind was reeling. Had Edmund and Victoria somehow known that the Titanic was in danger? Had they encouraged Charles to take that particular voyage, knowing it might be his last? The questions haunted me as I brought the photographs to O'Brien's office that evening. His reaction was immediate and furious. "This is criminal conspiracy," he said, spreading the photographs across his desk. "They've been systematically defrauding the family trust for years. But can we prove that documents are forged? With handwriting analysis, absolutely. But more importantly, we can prove they backdated these agreements to hide their theft." He pointed to one of the partnership documents. "Look at the paper itself, bits from a batch manufactured in 1911, but they claimed the document was signed in 1910. How can you tell? The watermark." Paper manufacturers changed their watermarks annually for precisely this reason, to prevent backdating fraud. O'Brien smiled grimly. "These people are clever, but they're not as clever as they think." Over the following days, we built an airtight case against Edmund and Victoria. The forged documents, combined with Charles's diary and the evidence from his safe deposit box, painted a clear picture of a family conspiracy to steal millions of dollars. But O'Brien warned me that proving their guilt was only the beginning of our battle. "They'll claim everything they did was legally authorized by the family trust," he explained. "They'll argue that Charles was financially irresponsible and that they were protecting family assets from his poor judgment, even with proof that they forged his signature. They'll claim those were corrections to reflect existing verbal agreements. They'll say Charles authorized the changes but died before he could sign the proper paperwork." O'Brien's expression was grim. "Margaret, these people have been planning this fraud for years. They have contingencies for every possible challenge." "Then we'll have to be smarter than they are," agreed. "But we need to be careful. If they realize what we've discovered, they might take more drastic action to protect themselves." I thought of Victoria's letter about Charles's change of perspective, and shivered. How far were they willing to go to protect their criminal enterprise? As it turned out, I was about to find out. The White Star Line insurance policy was worth $500,000, $500,000 that Edmund and Victoria had collected within weeks of Charles's death, while telling me that his estate was virtually worthless. I discovered it through the most unlikely source, Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, a fellow Titanic survivor, whose husband had also perished in the disaster. Eleanor contacted me after reading about my legal battle with the Whitmore family in the Boston Herald. The newspaper had picked up the story when O'Brien filed our preliminary injunctions, describing it as a widow's fight against one of Boston's most prominent families. "Mrs. Whitmore," Eleanor said when she arrived at my temporary lodgings on Marlborough Street, "I believe we may have similar problems with our late husband's families." Eleanor was a small, bird-like woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed despite her obvious financial distress. Her husband Robert had been a successful textile manufacturer from Philadelphia, and they had been traveling to Europe on what was meant to be their second honeymoon. After Robert's death, she explained, his brother claimed that all of Robert's business interests belonged to their family partnership. They offered me a small pension in exchange for waiving any claims against his estate. How much was the pension? $3,000 annually. Eleanor's voice was bitter. Robert's business was worth at least $500,000, but his family claimed he had been operating at a loss for years. I felt a chill of recognition. Did they mention insurance policies? That's exactly why I contacted you, Eleanor said, pulling out a folder of documents. I discovered that Robert's family had collected a substantial life insurance policy from White Star Line. Money they claimed didn't exist when they were calculating his estate. The insurance settlement documents she showed me were remarkably similar to what I suspected Edmund and Victoria had done. White Star Line had been paying out massive settlements to the families of first-class passengers who died in the disaster, but many families were hiding these payments from widows and other potential heirs. How did you discover the insurance payment? Robert's business partner felt guilty and contacted me confidentially. He told me that Robert's brother had collected the insurance money and used it to buy out Robert's share of the business for far less than it was worth. Eleanor's situation gave me a crucial insight into how Edmund and Victoria might be operating. If they had collected insurance money on Charles's life while claiming his estate was worthless, they had committed fraud on multiple levels. That afternoon, O'Brien and I visited the offices of Atlantic Maritime Insurance, the company that had underwritten many of the Titanic policies on behalf of White Star Line. The claims manager, a hurried-looking man named Thomas Bradley, was initially reluctant to discuss specific policies. Client confidentiality, he explained. We can't release information about insurance settlements without proper authorization. I'm Charles Whitmore's widow, I said, producing our marriage certificate and his death certificate. I should have authorization to review any policies on his life. Bradley consulted his files, then frowned. Mrs. Whitmore, according to our records, the settlement on your husband's policy was paid out to his designated beneficiary 3 months ago. Who was the designated beneficiary? The Whitmore Family Trust, represented by Edmund Whitmore. Bradley looked confused. Weren't you informed of this settlement? My hands clenched into fists. No, Mr. Bradley, I was not. The insurance settlement was for exactly $500,000. Paid to Edmund as the trust representative within 6 weeks of Charles's death. Edmund had signed an affidavit stating that he was authorized to collect all insurance proceeds on behalf of the family trust, and that all legal heirs had been properly notified. This is another felony, O'Brien said as we reviewed the insurance documents back at his office. They collected $500,000 while telling you that Charles's estate was worth $15,000. Can we prove Edmund wasn't authorized to collect the money? Better than that, O'Brien said, pulling out Charles's business files. Look at this. He showed me a copy of Charles's insurance beneficiary designation, filed with Atlantic Maritime just 6 months before the Titanic voyage. The primary beneficiary was listed as Margaret Whitmore, wife, with the family trust as a secondary beneficiary only if I predeceased Charles. They forged your death, O'Brien said grimly. Or, more precisely, they convinced the insurance company that you had waived your rights to the settlement. We requested copies of all documents related to the insurance settlement, and what we discovered was a masterclass in fraud. Edmund had submitted forged paperwork claiming that I had voluntarily renounced my claim to the insurance money in favor of the family trust. The signature was a skillful forgery, but the notarization was from a notary public who, according to city records, had died 2 months before the document was supposedly signed. They're getting sloppy, O'Brien observed, probably rushing to collect as much money as possible before you could mount a legal challenge. But the insurance fraud was just the beginning. Through Eleanor Caldwell's contacts, among other Titanic widows, we discovered that several wealthy families had used similar tactics to cheat their female relatives out of insurance settlements and estate assets. The pattern was always the same. Claim the deceased husband's estate was modest. Offer the widow a small annual pension. Collect substantial insurance payments and hidden assets. Then use forged documents to justify their actions if challenged. It's an organized scheme, O'Brien realized. These families are sharing strategies and legal tactics to defraud their own relatives. We began building a case that went far beyond simple inheritance fraud. Edmund and Victoria weren't just thieves, they were part of a network of wealthy families using the Titanic disaster to cover up systematic financial crimes. The investigation led us to a shocking discovery. Charles's decision to sail on the Titanic hadn't been his idea at all. Through shipping company records, we learned that Edmund had purchased our tickets and specifically requested the voyage dates. He had told Charles that important business contacts would be aboard the ship, making it an ideal opportunity to expand their European operations. Edmund arranged for Charles to be on that ship, I told O'Brien as the implications sank in. He couldn't have known it would sink, but he deliberately put Charles in a situation where something might happen. Or maybe he did know. O'Brien said quietly, Margaret, I've been investigating maritime insurance fraud for other clients. There were rumors before the Titanic sailed that White Star Line was having serious financial problems. Some people in the shipping industry were privately worried about the company's safety standards. The possibility that Edmund might have suspected the Titanic was dangerous and deliberately sent Charles anyway was almost too horrific to contemplate. But it fit with everything else we had discovered about his character. As we prepared to file criminal charges against Edmund and Victoria, I realized that Charles's death had revealed something far more sinister than simple family greed. The Whitmore family's fraud was part of a larger pattern of wealthy families exploiting tragedies to cover up their crimes. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the widow. They thought they could intimidate and cheat. Charles had been right about my strength, and I was about to use every bit of it to destroy them. The legal strategy document I drafted that night was 23 pages of carefully researched warfare. Sitting at my kitchen table with law books scattered around me like ammunition, I outlined every aspect of our case against the Whitmore family with the precision of a military campaign. O'Brien had given me the framework, but the details were mine. 3 years of legal education at Radcliffe, combined with months of investigating Edmund and Victoria's crimes, had taught me exactly how to dismantle their empire. Our strategy had 4 primary objectives: expose the forged documents, recover the stolen insurance money, prove systematic embezzlement from the family trust, and pursue criminal charges for fraud. But the real goal was complete destruction of their financial and social standing. They've built their entire lives on lies. I wrote in my summary, when the truth comes out, everything they've stolen will be returned with interest, and their reputations will be destroyed beyond repair. O'Brien arrived at my lodgings the next morning to review the strategy, bringing with him a pot of strong Irish coffee and a grim smile. Margaret, he said, settling into my small parlor, this is the most comprehensive legal assault I've ever seen. You've identified vulnerabilities I hadn't even considered. I had divided their criminal enterprise into categories: insurance fraud, document forgery, embezzlement, and conspiracy. For each category, I had documented specific crimes, identified physical evidence, and outlined the legal remedies available to us. The insurance fraud alone is worth 5 to 10 years in prison, I explained, pointing to the relevant section. But if we can prove they deliberately arranged for Charles to be on the Titanic knowing it might be dangerous, that becomes something much more serious. You're talking about conspiracy to commit murder. I'm talking about justice for my husband. O'Brien studied my analysis of the forged partnership documents. This handwriting analysis you've outlined, how do we prove the signatures are fake? Charles had a distinctive writing style, I said, producing samples of his genuine correspondence. He learned penmanship from a German tutor who emphasized particular letter formations. Any qualified expert will be able to identify the differences, but beyond the technical legal arguments, I had developed a broader strategy for destroying Edmund and Victoria's credibility. They had built their defense on the premise that I was a grieving widow who didn't understand complex business matters. I intended to prove that I understood them better than they did. We file everything simultaneously, I explained. Criminal charges, civil lawsuits, insurance fraud complaints, and requests for court-ordered audits of all family trust accounts. We hit them from every direction at once so they can't mount a coordinated defense. O'Brien was taking notes as I spoke, occasionally whistling softly at the scope of what I was proposing. The financial analysis alone will take months, he said. We're talking about auditing 30 years of trust accounts, business records, and personal finances. Then we'd better get started. Over the following week, O'Brien assembled our legal team. In addition to his own firm, we retained a forensic accountant named David Morse, a handwriting expert from Harvard, and a private investigator with connections in the shipping industry. Morse was a thin, meticulous man who approached financial fraud with the enthusiasm of a scholar studying ancient texts. When we showed him the evidence of embezzlement from the family trust, His eyes lit up with professional interest. "This is beautiful work," he said, examining the forged partnership documents. "They've created an entire alternate financial reality, but they made mistakes, small ones, but enough to hang them." The handwriting expert, Professor James Mitchell, was equally confident about exposing the forged signatures. "Your husband had very distinctive letter formations," he explained after examining Charles's genuine correspondence. "The forgeries are skillful, but they lack the unconscious muscle memory that creates truly authentic handwriting." Our private investigator, a former police detective named William Flynn, focused on the insurance fraud and the circumstances surrounding our Titanic voyage. What he discovered added a chilling dimension to Edmund's culpability. "Your brother-in-law had extensive conversations with White Star Line officials before booking your passage," Flynn reported. "According to shipping company employees I interviewed, Edmund specifically requested information about passenger manifests and voyage schedules. Why would he care about other passengers? He told White Star officials that he wanted to ensure Charles would have appropriate business networking opportunities during the voyage." Flynn's expression was grim, but according to the passenger manifest, there were no significant business contacts aboard the Titanic that would have interested someone in Charles's industries. The implication was clear. Edmund had lied about his reasons for arranging our passage. If business networking wasn't his motive, what was? Flynn had also discovered disturbing information about Edmund's financial situation before Charles's death. Despite the family's wealthy reputation, Edmund had been facing serious financial pressures due to failed investments and mounting debts. He needed Charles's money, Flynn explained. His personal finances were a disaster, and he'd been borrowing heavily against family assets to cover his losses. Charles's death had solved multiple problems for Edmund. It eliminated the family member most likely to discover his embezzlement, provided access to substantial insurance money, and removed the person who could challenge his control of the family business. As our investigation deepened, I began to understand the true scope of what Charles had been facing. His family hadn't just been stealing from him, they had been systematically destroying his financial independence while planning to eliminate him from the family business entirely. The Titanic disaster had simply accelerated their timeline, but our legal strategy went beyond proving their crimes. I wanted them to pay for what they had done to Charles, and I wanted other families to see what happened to people who thought they could exploit tragedy for personal gain. "We're not just seeking financial recovery," I told the team during our final strategy session. "We're setting a precedent. When this case is over, every wealthy family in America will know that widows aren't helpless victims to be cheated and dismissed." O'Brien smiled at my determination. "Margaret, when this is over, you'll be one of the most feared lawyers in Boston." "Good," I said. "It's time the Whitmore family learned what happens when you underestimate a woman with nothing left to lose." The War Council was complete. Our strategy was comprehensive. Our evidence was overwhelming, and our team was ready for battle. All that remained was to strike the first blow. Edmund and Victoria had no idea what was coming for them. The court filing papers landed on Harrison Pemberton's desk like a thunderbolt on a clear day. 47 pages of meticulous legal documentation, each paragraph a precision strike against the Whitmore family's carefully constructed lies. O'Brien had hand-delivered them to ensure maximum impact. Walking into Pemberton's offices with the confidence of a man holding 4 aces, Whitmore v. Whitmore Family Trust. The case was titled, "Civil Action for Fraud, Conspiracy, Embezzlement, and Recovery of Stolen Assets." I wasn't there to witness Pemberton's reaction, but O'Brien described it with evident satisfaction when he returned to my lodgings that afternoon. "His face went white as parchment," O'Brien reported, settling into my parlor with obvious pleasure. He read the first few pages, then called for Edmund immediately. I could hear him shouting from 3 rooms away. The lawsuit was comprehensive and devastating. We had charged Edmund and Victoria with 23 separate counts of fraud, including forging Charles's signature, stealing insurance money, embezzling from the family trust, and conspiracy to deprive me of my legal inheritance. The financial damages we sought totaled $2.8 million, every penny they had stolen, plus interest and punitive damages. But the real bombshell was buried on page 34, our request for criminal investigation into Edmund's role in arranging Charles's passage on the Titanic. We had stopped short of accusing him of deliberate murder, but we had presented enough circumstantial evidence to suggest that his actions might have contributed to Charles's death. The media response was immediate and explosive. The Boston Herald ran the story on its front page, under the headline "Titanic Widow Battles Boston Blue Bloods." The article portrayed me as a courageous woman fighting against a corrupt family conspiracy, while describing Edmund and Victoria as greedy relatives exploiting tragedy for personal gain. Within hours, reporters were camped outside the Whitmore mansion on Beacon Hill, shouting questions at Edmund and Victoria as they tried to enter and leave their home. The society pages, which had always treated the Whitmores with reverential respect, suddenly turned critical and invasive. Mrs. Whitmore's allegations, if proven, would represent one of the most shocking family fraud cases in Massachusetts history, wrote the society columnist for the Boston Globe. The idea that a prominent Boston family would systematically steal from one of their own members, particularly the widow of a Titanic victim, strikes at the very heart of what we consider civilized behavior. Edmund's response was predictably arrogant and tone-deaf. He gave a statement to the press dismissing my lawsuit as the desperate actions of a grief-stricken woman who refuses to accept the reality of her modest circumstances. My late brother, Charles, was a dreamer who lived beyond his means, Edmund told reporters. His widow seems to have inherited his tendency toward financial fantasy. We have offered her a generous settlement out of family loyalty, but she has chosen to pursue this unfortunate litigation instead. Victoria's comments were even more damaging to their cause. When cornered by a reporter outside her charity committee meeting, she made the mistake of speaking candidly about her contempt for me. "Margaret was never really one of us," Victoria said, apparently unaware that her words were being recorded. "She came from a middle-class family and never understood the responsibilities that come with true wealth. Charles spoiled her terribly, filling her head with ideas about business and law that were quite inappropriate for a woman of her station." The quote appeared in every major Boston newspaper the next day, painting Victoria as exactly the kind of entitled aristocrat that the city's working-class readers loved to hate. But our real victory came when Judge William Harrison agreed to our requests for emergency injunctions freezing all Whitmore family assets, pending the outcome of the case. The judge, a stern man in his 60s with no patience for financial shenanigans, had read our filing with obvious interest. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said during the emergency hearing, "your allegations are extraordinarily serious. If proven, they would constitute criminal fraud on a massive scale." "That is precisely our contention, Your Honor," O'Brien replied. "The defendants have systematically looted the family trust while lying to my client about the value of her husband's estate." Judge Harrison turned to Pemberton, who was representing Edmund and Victoria. "Mr. Pemberton, how do you respond to the allegation that your clients collected a $500,000 insurance settlement while telling Mrs. Whitmore that her husband's estate was worth $15,000? Pemberton cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor, the insurance settlement was paid to the family trust, which is a separate legal entity from Mr. Charles Whitmore's personal estate, but Mrs. Whitmore was the primary beneficiary of that insurance policy, was she not? There may have been some administrative confusion about the beneficiary designations." Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Administrative confusion, Mr. Pemberton. Either Mrs. Whitmore was the designated beneficiary or she wasn't. Which is it?" The exchange went downhill rapidly for Pemberton. Under direct questioning from the judge, he was forced to admit that Edmund had collected insurance money that legally belonged to me, that the family had never informed me of the insurance settlement, and that they had offered me a settlement based on deliberately false information about Charles's estate value. "I'm granting the plaintiff's request for emergency injunctions," Judge Harrison announced. "All Whitmore family assets, including trust accounts, business interests, and personal property, are hereby frozen pending resolution of this case. Furthermore, I'm ordering an immediate forensic audit of all family financial records dating back 10 years. The courtroom erupted. Edmund shot to his feet, his face red with rage. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. You're destroying our family's reputation based on the unsubstantiated accusations of a Mr. Whitmore." Judge Harrison interrupted sharply. "I suggest you sit down and consult with your attorney before making any statements you might later regret." But Edmund was beyond rational thought. "This woman is nothing but a gold digger who married my brother for his money. She has no right to bailiff," the judge said calmly. "If Mr. Whitmore speaks again without permission, please hold him in contempt of court." The hearing ended with Edmund and Victoria storming out of the courtroom, followed by a crowd of reporters shouting questions. I remained seated, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we had just accomplished. Margaret, O'Brien said quietly, "You've just won the first battle. But the war is far from over." He was right, of course. Edmund and Victoria would fight back with everything they had. But for the first time since Charles's death, I felt like I was the one in control. The Whitmore family had ruled Boston society through intimidation and corruption for decades. Now they were about to learn what happened when someone fought back with the truth. The immigration records told the story that Edmund and Victoria had spent decades trying to erase. Hidden in the dusty archives of Boston's immigration office, I discovered that the mighty Whitmore family had arrived in America in 1847 as penniless Irish refugees fleeing the potato famine with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Flynn, our private investigator, had suggested searching immigration records after noticing discrepancies in the family's official history. According to their social biographies, the Whitmores were descended from English merchants who had arrived in Boston during the colonial period. The truth was far more humble and far more recent. Cornelius Whitmore, aged 23, laborer; Bridget Whitmore, aged 21, domestic servant, County Cork, Ireland, read the immigration document dated September 12, 1847. They had arrived aboard a coffin ship called the Mercy, one of hundreds of vessels that carried desperate Irish families to America during the famine years. The records showed that Cornelius had worked as a dock laborer for nearly a decade before saving enough money to purchase a small fishing boat. From there, through what appeared to be a combination of hard work, strategic marriages, and ruthless business practices, he had built the foundation of the Whitmore shipping empire. But the most damning discovery was evidence of how Cornelius had transformed his family's image. In 1867, 20 years after arriving in Boston, he had legally changed the family name from a Whitmore to Whitmore, eliminating the Irish prefix that marked their origins. He had also begun claiming English ancestry in business documents and social registrations. "They've been living a lie for 50 years, Flynn explained as we reviewed the documents in O'Brien's office. "Everything about their background, the English ancestry, the colonial roots, the old money reputation, it's all fabricated." More significantly, the immigration records revealed a pattern of questionable business practices that stretched back to the family's earliest days in America. Cornelius had been investigated multiple times for insurance fraud related to ships that had mysteriously sunk with valuable cargo aboard. He had also been accused of bribing port officials to overlook safety violations and using political connections to eliminate business competitors. "The corruption is generational," O'Brien observed. Edmund and Victoria didn't invent these tactics, they inherited them. But the real treasure trove was in the genealogical records that Flynn had uncovered through his contacts at various Boston churches and civic organizations. The Whitmore family tree, as presented to Boston society, was almost entirely fictional. The family claimed descent from Sir Reginald Whitmore, a supposed English knight who had allegedly fought in the Crusades. In reality, their actual ancestor was Patrick O'Whitmore, a tenant farmer from County Cork who had been evicted from his land during the famine and had died in a workhouse in Ireland. They claimed their fortune was built on 3 generations of maritime commerce. In fact, Cornelius had started with a single fishing boat and had built his fleet through a series of insurance scams, fraudulent partnerships, and strategic bankruptcies that left his business partners ruined while he emerged wealthier. Most tellingly, they claimed that their wealth came from traditional conservative investments and careful stewardship of family assets. The truth was that every generation of Whitmores had engaged in fraud, embezzlement, and corruption to maintain their lifestyle. "It explains everything," I said, studying the pattern of financial crimes that stretched back decades. Charles was different because he was actually trying to build legitimate businesses. Edmund and Victoria are just continuing the family tradition of theft and fraud. The immigration records also provided crucial evidence for our legal case. If the Whitmore family trust had been established based on false information about the family's origins and wealth, it could be declared invalid. More importantly, the pattern of generational fraud supported our argument that Edmund and Victoria's crimes against Charles and me were part of a deliberate, ongoing conspiracy. But perhaps the most valuable discovery was evidence of how the family had used their fabricated reputation to gain social and political influence. They had joined exclusive clubs, donated to prominent charities, and cultivated relationships with judges, politicians, and business leaders, all based on lies about their background and the source of their wealth. This is their Achilles heel, O'Brien realized. Boston society values nothing more than authentic pedigree. If word gets out that the Whitmores are actually Irish immigrants who built their fortune through fraud, their social standing will collapse overnight. I finished. We began leaking selected information to society, journalists, and gossip columnists, carefully timing the revelations for maximum impact. The response was swift and devastating. Whitmore, family built on lies, screamed the headline in the Boston Social Register. Sources close to family revealed decades of deception about origins and wealth. The article detailed the family's true immigration history, their name change, and their pattern of questionable business practices. But what really destroyed them was the revelation that they had been lying to their social peers for decades about their background. Boston's elite society was merciless in its response. The Whitmores were quietly dropped from guest lists. Their memberships in exclusive clubs were suddenly under review, and their charitable donations were returned, with polite letters expressing concerns about the source of funding. Victoria was particularly devastated by the social exile. She had built her entire identity around her position in Boston society, serving on charity boards and hosting elaborate parties for the city's elite. Suddenly, she found herself persona non grata in the world she had dominated for decades. The social pressure intensified the legal pressure we were already applying. Judge Harrison's asset freeze had left Edmund and Victoria with limited resources to fight our lawsuit. And now they were facing social disgrace, as well as potential criminal charges. But the immigration records revealed something even more damaging, evidence that the family had been systematically hiding assets in overseas accounts for decades. Cornelius had established banking relationships in Ireland and England, ostensibly to support his shipping business, but actually to hide money from creditors and tax authorities. If we can prove they're still using those overseas accounts, Flynn explained, we can charge them with tax evasion and international fraud. The scope of the Whitmore family's criminal enterprise was breathtaking. What had started as Charles's death and my fight for my inheritance had uncovered a 50-year conspiracy involving fraud, corruption, and systematic theft. Edmund and Victoria weren't just criminals, they were part of a generational criminal organization, masquerading as a respectable Boston family. And now, thanks to Charles's foresight in preserving the evidence of their crimes, the entire rotten structure was beginning to collapse. Victoria's private letters were a masterpiece of spite and calculation, hidden in a locked drawer of her writing desk that Flynn had somehow managed to access during his investigation. The correspondence revealed a woman consumed by jealousy and resentment, willing to destroy her own brother to maintain her privileged position. The letters spanned 3 years, from my engagement to Charles through the months following his death. Reading them was like watching poison slowly infect a family, drop by venomous drop. The earliest letter was addressed to her cousin Constance in Newport, dated 2 weeks after Charles announced our engagement. Dearest Constance, you cannot imagine my horror at Charles's latest folly. This Margaret Hartwell creature has completely bewitched him with her supposed intelligence and modern ideas. She's nothing but a physician's daughter from Cambridge, hardly our sort of people. But Charles seems determined to marry her, despite Edmund's objections and my own concerns. I fear she's after the family money, though Charles is too smitten to see it. We must find a way to protect the family interests before it's too late. The letters grew progressively more hostile as our relationship with Charles deepened. Victoria had apparently conducted a thorough investigation into my family background, hiring private detectives to search for any scandal or impropriety that might convince Charles to abandon our engagement. The Hartwell family is disappointingly respectable, she wrote in frustration. The father is well regarded in his profession, the mother comes from decent Massachusetts stock, and Margaret herself graduated with honors from Radcliffe. I had hoped to discover some shameful secret that would open Charles's eyes, but they appeared to be genuinely accomplished people. This makes her even more dangerous, as she has the intelligence to understand our family's business affairs. That phrase chilled me. Understand our family's business affairs. Victoria had recognized from the beginning that I posed a threat to whatever schemes she and Edmund were planning. After our marriage, the letters became increasingly conspiratorial. Victoria had begun coordinating with Edmund to limit Charles's access to family financial information and to undermine his authority in business decisions. Edmund and I have decided that Charles must be gradually excluded from family financial planning. His wife asks too many questions, and he's begun sharing information with her that should remain strictly within the family. We've instructed Pemberton to modify the trust documents to give Edmund greater authority over business decisions. Charles doesn't suspect anything yet, but we must move carefully. The most damning letter was dated just 1 month before. Charles and I sailed on the Titanic. Charles has become impossible to manage. He's demanding access to all family financial records and threatening to bring in outside auditors to review our business operations. His wife has clearly been encouraging this rebellion. I've seen her reading legal documents in their study, and Charles defers to her judgment far too often. Edmund believes we may need to take drastic action to protect the family's interests. If Charles continues this course, we may have no choice but to remove him from family business entirely, regardless of the personal cost. But it was the final letter in the series, written just 3 weeks after the Titanic sank, that revealed the true depth of Victoria's malice. I know it's terrible to say, but Charles's death may have been a blessing in disguise. He had become completely unmanageable, and his wife's influence was turning him against his own family. Now we can implement our plans without his interference. The widow is grief-stricken and knows nothing about business. She accept whatever settlement we offer and disappear from our lives. Edmund has already begun transferring Charles's assets to family trust accounts where she cannot reach them. By the time she realizes what has happened, it will be too late for her to challenge our actions legally. Reading those words, I felt a rage so pure and cold that it frightened me. Victoria had celebrated my husband's death as a blessing that would allow her to steal my inheritance without interference. She had viewed Charles's tragic fate as a convenient solution to her problems, but the letters also contained crucial evidence for our legal case. Victoria had explicitly described their plans to remove Charles from family business and transfer his assets to family trust accounts, where I couldn't reach them. She had documented their conspiracy in her own handwriting, providing irrefutable proof of their premeditated fraud. O'Brien was ecstatic when I brought him the letters. Margaret, this is better than a signed confession. She's admitted to conspiracy, fraud, and deliberate deception of a legal heir. No jury will have any sympathy for her after reading these. But the letters revealed something even more disturbing. Victoria's role in the family crimes had been far more active than we had suspected. She hadn't just supported Edmund's schemes, she had been one of their primary architects. The correspondence showed that Victoria had been embezzling money from various Boston charities where she served on the boards. She had used her social position to gain access to charitable funds, then diverted the money to personal accounts while covering up the theft through false accounting. She's been stealing from children's hospitals and orphanages, Flynn said, with disgust as he reviewed the financial evidence Victoria's letters had led us to discover. She took money meant for the city's poorest families and used it to fund her lavish lifestyle. The charitable embezzlement added a new dimension to our case against the Whitmore family. Not only had they stolen from Charles and me, but they had also been systematically robbing Boston's most vulnerable citizens through their charitable activities. When news of Victoria's charitable fraud broke in the newspapers, the public reaction was swift and furious. Boston's working-class families, many of whom had donated money to the charities Victoria had robbed, demanded justice with an intensity that surprised even the seasoned journalists covering the story. Whitmore family stole from orphans, read the Boston Herald's headline, "Society Lady Accused of Embezzling Thousands from Children's Charities." The article detailed Victoria's theft from 3 different charitable organizations, including a children's hospital that served the city's Irish immigrant community, and an orphanage that cared for children whose fathers had died in industrial accidents. The irony wasn't lost on the press. A family of Irish immigrants who had hidden their origins was now accused of stealing from the very community they had abandoned. Victoria's response to the exposure was predictably self-serving. Through her lawyer, she issued a statement claiming that the charitable funds had been temporarily borrowed to cover urgent family obligations and would be fully repaid with interest. But the damage to her reputation was irreversible. The same society that had once celebrated her charitable work now viewed her as a common thief who had exploited their trust to fund her personal luxuries. More importantly for our legal case, Victoria's charitable embezzlement demonstrated a pattern of financial crimes that supported our broader allegations against the family. The jury would see that stealing from Charles and me was just the latest crime in a decades-long pattern of fraud and theft. As I sat in my small parlor that evening, Reviewing Victoria's letters one final time, I marveled at the depth of her self-deception. She had convinced herself that her crimes were justified by her social position and family loyalty, never acknowledging the real people whose lives she had damaged through her greed. But Charles had been right about my strength. Victoria had underestimated me because I was a woman, because I was grieving, because I came from a middle-class family rather than Boston aristocracy. That underestimation would be her downfall. The sister who had celebrated my husband's death was about to learn what happened when she betrayed the wrong widow. The bank seizure orders arrived at Edmund's office on a Tuesday morning like financial death warrants. By noon, every Whitmore family account had been frozen, every business operation had been suspended, and every asset had been placed under court supervision pending the outcome of our lawsuit. Judge Harrison had acted swiftly after reviewing the evidence of Victoria's charitable embezzlement and the pattern of family fraud we had uncovered. His orders were comprehensive and devastating. All assets, accounts, properties, and business interests associated with the Whitmore Family Trust and its beneficiaries are hereby placed under the supervision of the court-appointed receiver pending resolution of criminal and civil charges. The court-appointed receiver was David Morse, our forensic accountant, who now had unlimited authority to examine every aspect of the Whitmore family's finances. Edmund and Victoria could no longer access their bank accounts, sell their properties, or make any significant financial decisions without court approval. It's financial house arrest, O'Brien explained with obvious satisfaction. They can't spend money, move money, or hide money. Everything they do is subject to court oversight. The immediate impact on Edmund's business empire was catastrophic. Whitmore Industrial Holdings had been leveraged to the hilt, using family trust assets as collateral for massive loans. When the court froze those assets, the company's creditors immediately demanded payment of outstanding debts. Within 4 hours of the seizure orders, 3 major banks had called in loans totaling $400,000. To steel suppliers had suspended deliveries, pending payment of overdue invoices. The U.S. Navy had canceled a contract for ship plating after learning about the legal proceedings. Edmund's carefully constructed industrial empire was collapsing like a house of cards. But the real disaster for Edmund and Victoria was personal, rather than financial. The asset freeze meant they could no longer maintain their lavish lifestyle. The army of servants was dismissed, the expensive automobiles were impounded, and the Newport mansion was shuttered under court order. Victoria was particularly devastated by the sudden change in circumstances. Accustomed to spending hundreds of dollars monthly on clothes, jewelry, and entertainment, she now found herself limited to a court-approved allowance of $50 per week for basic living expenses. The social humiliation was even worse than the financial constraints. Boston society, always quick to abandon those who had fallen from grace, turned on the Whitmores with vindictive enthusiasm. The same people who had attended Victoria's elaborate parties now crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. They're completely isolated, Flynn reported after conducting surveillance of their activities. Edmund spends his days meeting with lawyers, trying to find some way to challenge the court orders. Victoria hardly leaves the house anymore, too embarrassed to show her face in public. But Edmund's desperation was leading him to make increasingly reckless decisions. Convinced that he could still salvage his situation through legal maneuvering, he had hired 3 different law firms to challenge various aspects of our case. The problem was that he no longer had access to the family fortune to pay legal fees. His lawyers were demanding payment upfront, and Edmund was rapidly running out of liquid assets that weren't frozen by the court. Morse's forensic audit was uncovering new evidence of fraud almost daily. The depth of the family's financial crimes was staggering. Embezzlement from the family trust, theft from charitable organizations, tax evasion, insurance fraud, and systematic deception of business partners and creditors. They've been operating like an organized crime family, Morse reported during one of our weekly strategy meetings. Every transaction was designed to benefit them personally while shifting risk and liability to other parties. The audit had also revealed the true scope of Charles's wealth, which was even larger than we had initially suspected. His business investments were worth over $3 million, making him one of the wealthiest men in Boston at the time of his death. Your husband was a financial genius, Morse told me with genuine admiration. While Edmund was running traditional family businesses into the ground, Charles was building a diversified investment portfolio that would have made him independently wealthy within a few years. The revelation that Charles had been far more successful than his family had claimed added another dimension to their betrayal. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they had stolen the legacy of a man who had surpassed them all in business acumen and financial success. But Edmund's most desperate gambit was his attempt to claim that Charles's death had invalidated all of his business partnerships and contracts. Through his lawyers, Edmund argued that the court should declare Charles's investments null and void because he had died before fulfilling various business obligations. It's legal nonsense, O'Brien explained, but it shows how desperate they've become. Edmund is trying to argue that Charles's death somehow eliminated his ownership of assets that legally belonged to his estate. Judge Harrison was unimpressed by Edmund's arguments during a hearing on the motion. He delivered a scathing rebuke that made headlines in every Boston newspaper. Mr. Whitmore, your legal theory appears to be that death is a form of business bankruptcy that eliminates a person's assets and transfers them to their relatives. This is not only legally incorrect, but morally reprehensible. The court will not permit you to use your brother's tragic death as a justification for stealing his widow's inheritance. The judge's words were quoted extensively in the press, further damaging Edmund's already ruined reputation. Public opinion had turned decisively against the Whitmore family, with editorial writers comparing them to vultures feeding on tragedy, and aristocratic parasites stealing from their own family. The financial pressure was also taking a psychological toll on both Edmund and Victoria. According to Flynn's surveillance, Edmund had begun drinking heavily and was frequently seen arguing with creditors outside his office building. Victoria had suffered what appeared to be a nervous breakdown and was rarely seen in public. "They're cracking under the pressure," Flynn observed. 50 years of living lies and committing crimes is finally catching up with them. But the most significant development was Edmund's growing paranoia about his legal situation. Convinced that we had access to information that could send him to prison, he had become obsessed with discovering the source of our evidence. He's been asking questions about Charles's personal effects, Flynn reported. He seems to believe that Charles left behind documents that could incriminate the family. Edmund's paranoia was well-founded, of course. Charles had indeed left behind evidence of the family's crimes, carefully preserved in his safe deposit box and diary. But Edmund's desperate search for that evidence was leading him to make increasingly reckless mistakes. The financial earthquake we had triggered was about to produce aftershocks that would destroy what remained of the Whitmore family's power and reputation. And I was just getting started. Charles's final letter to me was sealed in an envelope marked for my beloved Margaret to be opened only in the event of my death. I found it in the very back of his safe deposit box, hidden beneath all the financial documents and business papers, as if he had placed it there as a final gift for me to discover. The envelope was cream-colored paper with his personal seal pressed into dark blue wax. My hands trembled as I broke the seal and unfolded the 3 pages of his distinctive handwriting. Dated April 10, 1912, the day we boarded the Titanic. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this letter, then my worst fears have been realized and I am no longer with you. I pray that you will never need to see these words. But if fate has been cruel to us, then you must know the truth about everything I have kept hidden from you. I have tried to protect you from the ugliness of my family's character, but I realize now that my silence may have left you vulnerable to their schemes. Edmund and Victoria are not merely difficult relatives, they are criminals who have been systematically stealing from the family trust for years. I have been gathering evidence of their crimes, intending to expose them and see justice done, but if I am gone, that responsibility falls to you. You will find in this safe deposit box all the proof you need to destroy them utterly. Bank records, forged documents, correspondence, everything necessary to see them imprisoned for their crimes. But more than that, you will find evidence of your own worth and strength that I hope will sustain you in the dark days ahead. Margaret, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Your intelligence, your courage, your fierce sense of justice, these qualities that first drew me to you, will be your weapons against my family's corruption. They will underestimate you because you are a woman, because you are grieving, because they cannot imagine that someone with a conscience could be as ruthless as they are. That will be their fatal mistake. I have loved you more deeply than I ever thought possible to love another human being. You have made me a better man than I ever dreamed I could be. If circumstances have taken me from you, please know that every moment we shared was worth whatever price I have paid. But do not let grief make you gentle with my family. They destroyed my father's trust in them. They poisoned my childhood with their schemes. and they have spent years planning to cheat you of everything that should rightfully be yours. Show them no mercy, because they will show you none. You have your law degree, you have your brilliant mind, and now you have the evidence to expose their crimes. Use all of it. Destroy them as completely as they tried to destroy us. The money in these accounts is yours not just by right of inheritance, but because you have earned it through every moment of happiness you gave me. Build the life you deserve. Practice law as you always dreamed. And know that somewhere beyond this world, I am watching you with pride and love. Fight them, my darling. Fight them with everything you have, and when you have won and you will win, remember that justice for us both will have been served. All my love, always and forever. Charles. The key to defeating them is an understanding that their entire lives are built on lies. Strip away their pretensions, expose their crimes, and they will crumble like the hollow shells they have always been. You are stronger than all of them combined. I read the letter 3 times before the tears blurred my vision too much to continue. Charles had known. He had known exactly what his family was capable of, and he had prepared me for this battle even as he faced his own death. But beyond the overwhelming grief of reading his final words, I felt something else, a fierce, burning determination that was stronger than anything I had experienced before. Charles had entrusted me with his legacy and his love. He had armed me with the tools to destroy his family's corruption, and he had reminded me that I possessed the strength to see justice done. The letter also resolved a question that had been haunting me for months: why Charles had been so secretive about his business affairs. He hadn't been hiding his success from me, he had been protecting me from his family's inevitable retaliation when they discovered his plans to expose their crimes. They will underestimate you because you are a woman, because you are grieving, because they cannot imagine that someone with a conscience could be as ruthless as they are. Charles had been absolutely right. Edmund and Victoria had dismissed me as a helpless widow who could be intimidated and cheated. They had no idea they were facing a woman armed with law degree, devastating evidence, and a husband's final instructions to show them no mercy. That evening, I shared the letter with O'Brien in the privacy of his office. He read it in silence, his expression growing more grim with each paragraph. "Margaret," he said finally, "this letter changes the entire nature of our case. It's not just evidence of the family's crimes, it's proof that Charles died knowing they were planning to destroy you financially. How does that help us legally? It establishes premeditation. We can argue that Edmund and Victoria's fraud wasn't opportunistic. It was a deliberate conspiracy that Charles discovered before his death." O'Brien's eyes gleamed with the fervor of a prosecutor who had just found the perfect piece of evidence. "This letter proves that they didn't just steal from you after Charles died. They were planning to steal from you while he was still alive." But the letter's real power was emotional rather than legal. Reading Charles's final words to me had crystallized something that had been building for months. This wasn't just about money or justice anymore. This was about honoring the memory of a man who had loved me enough to prepare for his own death by ensuring I could defend myself against his family's corruption. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even O'Brien. Instead of keeping Charles's letter private, I decided to release portions of it to the press. "Are you certain?" O'Brien asked. "Once the newspapers print his words, there's no taking them back. Charles told me to fight them with everything I have," I replied. "His letter is one of my weapons, and I intend to use it." The Boston Herald published excerpts from Charles's letter on its front page under the headline, "Titanic Victims' Final Words Expose Family Conspiracy." The article included Charles's warnings about Edmund and Victoria's criminal behavior, and his instructions for me to show them no mercy. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Charles's letter transformed me from a grieving widow seeking her inheritance into a woman carrying out her beloved husband's final wishes for justice. The romantic tragedy of his final message, combined with the shocking revelations about his family's crimes, captured the public imagination in a way that no legal filing could have achieved. Editorial writers praised Charles's foresight and my courage in continuing his fight against corruption. Religious leaders cited the letter as an example of love transcending death. Women's organizations held rallies supporting my legal battle as a symbol of female empowerment in the face of male oppression. But the letter's most devastating impact was on Edmund and Victoria themselves. Reading their brother's final words, his description of them as criminals who had poisoned his childhood with their schemes, broke something fundamental in their relationship with each other. According to Flynn's surveillance, Victoria had suffered a complete emotional collapse after reading the newspaper coverage. She was seen leaving her house for the first time in weeks, walking aimlessly through Boston Common while sobbing uncontrollably. Edmund's reaction was even more dramatic. He appeared at the offices of the Boston Herald, demanding to speak with the editor about slanderous attacks on his family's reputation. When security refused to let him into the building, he stood on the sidewalk outside, shouting about lies and conspiracies until police escorted him away. "They're completely unraveling," O'Brien observed. "Charles's letter has destroyed whatever psychological defenses they had left." But beyond the emotional devastation, the letter had also eliminated any remaining public sympathy for Edmund and Victoria. Charles's words, written in the shadow of his own death, carried a moral authority that no legal argument could match. The public now saw them not as grieving relatives trying to protect family assets, but as heartless criminals stealing from their own brother's widow. The letter had also provided me with something I hadn't realized I needed: closure with Charles himself. Reading his final words, understanding that he had died knowing how much he loved me and trusting me to carry on his fight, had healed something in my heart that months of grief couldn't touch. I was no longer just Margaret Whitmore, the Titanic widow fighting for her inheritance. I was Margaret Whitmore, the woman chosen by a dying man to be his instrument of justice. Charles had armed me with evidence, prepared me for battle, and given me his final blessing to destroy his family's corruption. The reckoning he had foreseen was about to arrive, and I intended to make sure it was everything he had hoped it would be. The complete financial audit report was 300 pages of devastating documentation. Each page another nail in the coffin of the Whitmore family's criminal enterprise. David Morse had spent 6 months meticulously examining every transaction, every document, every bank record spanning 30 years of family financial operations. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the morning Morse presented his findings. Reporters from every major newspaper in New England filled the gallery, along with representatives from the district attorney's office who were preparing criminal charges based on our evidence. Judge Harrison called for order as Morse approached the witness stand, carrying a leather satchel that contained the organized proof of the family's systematic fraud. "Mr. Morse," O'Brien began, "please summarize for the court the scope of your financial investigation into the Whitmore Family Trust." Morse adjusted his spectacles and opened his report. "Your Honor, over the past 6 months I have examined approximately 12,000 financial documents, including bank records, business contracts, property deeds, insurance policies, and personal correspondence. My findings reveal a pattern of fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy spanning 3 decades." The gallery murmured as Morse outlined the basic structure of the family's crimes. But the real drama began when he started presenting specific evidence. The defendants claimed that Charles Whitmore's personal estate was worth approximately $15,000 at the time of his death. Morse continued, "My audit reveals that his actual assets totaled $3.2 million, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in Massachusetts." Edmund shot to his feet at the defense table. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. These numbers are completely fabricated." "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Harrison said sharply, "you will remain seated and silent unless specifically called upon to speak." Morse proceeded methodically through the evidence. Charles's hidden bank accounts, worth $847,000, his business partnerships, valued at $1.6 million, his real estate investments, worth $400,000, his stock portfolio, worth $350,000. Furthermore, Morse testified, "I discovered evidence that the defendants had knowledge of these assets and deliberately concealed them from Mrs. Whitmore during estate proceedings." O'Brien introduced exhibit after exhibit: the forged partnership documents, the stolen insurance money, the embezzled charitable funds, the falsified trust records. Each piece of evidence built upon the previous one, creating an overwhelming picture of calculated criminality. But the most damaging testimony came when Morse explained how Edmund and Victoria had systematically stolen from the family trust over a period of 20 years. The defendants used a sophisticated scheme to embezzle approximately $800,000 from family trust accounts. Morse testified, they would create false invoices for business expenses, then divert the money to personal accounts. They purchased properties using trust funds but registered ownership in their personal names. They took unauthorized salaries and bonuses while claiming the family businesses were operating at a loss. The gallery gasped as Morse described transaction after transaction, each one representing thousands of dollars stolen from the trust that was supposed to protect family assets for future generations. Did the defendants attempt to hide these transactions? O'Brien asked. Yes. They maintained two sets of books, one showing the actual financial transactions, and another showing false information that they presented to other family members and outside auditors. When Pemberton rose to cross-examine Morse, his questions were desperate and unfocused. He challenged the audit methodology, questioned the authenticity of documents, and suggested that the financial discrepancies were due to accounting errors rather than deliberate fraud. But Morse had anticipated every challenge. He calmly explained his methodology, produced backup documentation for every claim, and demonstrated how the pattern of errors always benefited Edmund and Victoria at the expense of other family members. Mr. Pemberton, Morse said during one particularly heated exchange, in 30 years of forensic accounting, I have never seen accounting errors that are so consistently profitable for the supposed victims of those errors. The courtroom erupted in laughter, and Judge Harrison had to call for order. The prosecution of our case continued for 3 days. O'Brien called witness after witness to testify about different aspects of the family's crimes. The insurance investigator who confirmed that Edmund had fraudulently collected my life insurance money. The handwriting expert who proved that Charles's signatures had been forged. The bank officials who described how Edmund had used false documents to access accounts that didn't belong to him. But the most powerful testimony came from Eleanor, Caldwell, and other Titanic widows who had discovered similar fraud in their own families. Their stories demonstrated that the Whitmore case wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of wealthy families exploiting maritime disasters to cover up financial crimes. These families saw the Titanic disaster as an opportunity. Eleanor testified. They knew that grieving widows would be vulnerable, that communities would be sympathetic to their claims of financial hardship, and that the tragedy would distract attention from their own criminal behavior. When it came time for Edmund and Victoria to present their defense, they had virtually nothing to offer. Pemberton called character witnesses who testified about the family's charitable work and social standing. But their testimony was undermined by the evidence of embezzlement from those same charities. Edmund himself took the stand on the final day of testimony, and his performance was a disaster. Under O'Brien's cross-examination, he was forced to admit that he had collected insurance money that legally belonged to me, that he had forged Charles's signature on multiple documents, and that he had lied about the value of Charles's estate. Mr. Whitmore, O'Brien asked, when you told Mrs. Whitmore that her husband's estate was worth $15,000, did you know that he actually had over $3 million in assets? The family finances are complicated, ... double quotes. Edmund stammered, please answer the question. Did you know your brother was worth over $3 million when you told his widow he was worth $15,000? Edmund's face was red with humiliation and rage. Yes, he finally admitted, I knew. The courtroom was silent as the implications of his admission sank in. Edmund had just confessed to deliberately defrauding me of millions of dollars while I was grieving my husband's death. Victoria never took the stand. According to her lawyer, she was too emotionally distraught to testify, but her absence spoke volumes about the weakness of their defense. In his closing argument, O'Brien painted a picture of a family so consumed by greed that they had celebrated Charles's death as an opportunity to steal from his widow. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, the evidence in this case reveals a level of callousness that defies comprehension. These defendants didn't just steal money, they stole from their own brother's widow, while she was grieving the most traumatic loss of her life. They turned family tragedy into personal profit, and they did it with deliberate, calculated malice. Closing argument was a desperate appeal for sympathy. Based on the family's financial difficulties and their genuine grief over Charles's death. But after 3 days of overwhelming evidence, his words rang hollow. Judge Harrison's instructions to the jury were clear and direct. You must determine whether the defendants deliberately concealed assets and defrauded Mrs. Whitmore of her rightful inheritance. The evidence of their intent and the scope of their deception will guide your verdict. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their decision. Guilty on all counts. The final court judgment was a document of poetic justice, 47 pages that systematically dismantled everything Edmund and Victoria had built through decades of fraud and corruption. Judge Harrison delivered his ruling on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Charles and I had planned to return from our European honeymoon. In the matter of Whitmore v. Whitmore Family Trust, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. This court finds that the defendants have engaged in a systematic campaign of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy that represents one of the most egregious cases of family financial abuse in Massachusetts legal history. The courtroom was silent as he continued, each word sealing Edmund and Victoria's fate with judicial precision. The evidence presented demonstrates that Edmund Whitmore and Victoria Whitmore deliberately concealed assets worth $3.2 million from the plaintiff while offering her a settlement of $2,000 annually based on fraudulent information about her husband's estate value. This court finds such behavior to be not merely criminal, but morally reprehensible in its exploitation of grief and tragedy. Judge Harrison's eyes fixed on Edmund, who sat slumped at the defense table, his face ashen and defeated. Mr. Edmund Whitmore, you have been found guilty of insurance fraud, document forgery, embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud. The court hereby sentences you to 7 years imprisonment and orders you to pay restitution of $2.8 million to Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. Edmund's lawyer immediately began objecting, but Judge Harrison silenced him with a raised hand. Miss Victoria Whitmore, the judge continued, turning his attention to Charles's sister, you have been found guilty of charitable embezzlement, conspiracy to defraud, and accessory to insurance fraud. The court hereby sentences you to 5 years imprisonment and orders you to pay restitution of $1.2 million. Victoria began sobbing uncontrollably, but Judge Harrison showed no mercy. Furthermore, he continued, this court orders the complete dissolution of the Whitmore Family Trust, which has been revealed to be nothing more than a criminal enterprise masquerading as a legitimate financial entity. All assets currently held by the trust are hereby transferred to Mrs. Margaret Whitmore as the rightful heir to her husband's estate. The financial judgment was devastating in its completeness. Every property, every bank account, every business interest that Edmund and Victoria had claimed through fraud was now legally mine. The Beacon Hill Mansion, the Newport Estate, the industrial holdings, the overseas accounts, everything they had stolen was being returned with interest and penalties. But the judge wasn't finished. The court also finds that the defendants' crimes extend beyond simple financial fraud. Their systematic exploitation of the Titanic disaster, their calculated abuse of a grieving widow, and their complete lack of remorse for their actions demonstrate a level of moral bankruptcy that demands the strongest possible response from this legal system. Judge Harrison paused, allowing his words to sink in before delivering his final blow. Therefore, this court is referring all evidence in this case to the Massachusetts Attorney General for potential criminal prosecution under state racketeering statutes. The defendants' crimes constitute an ongoing criminal enterprise that may warrant additional charges beyond those addressed in this civil proceeding. The gallery erupted as reporters rushed from the courtroom to file their stories. The headlines the next day would scream variations of Whitmore criminals destroyed by Titanic widow and Boston blue bloods sentenced to prison for family fraud. But beyond the legal victory, the judgment represented something far more significant: the complete vindication of Charles's faith in my strength and my ability to seek justice for both of us. The financial consequences for Edmund and Victoria were immediate and crushing. Within hours of the judgment, court officers were seizing their remaining personal property to satisfy the restitution orders. Their jewelry, artwork, automobiles, and personal belongings were all subject to confiscation. The social consequences were even more devastating. Boston society, which had already abandoned them during the trial, now treated them as pariahs. Former friends crossed the street to avoid acknowledging them. Charitable organizations removed their names from donor lists and board positions. Social clubs quietly revoked their memberships. Victoria's response to the judgment was a complete psychological collapse. According to newspaper reports, she had to be sedated and hospitalized after hearing her sentence. The woman who had once dominated Boston charity events and social gatherings was now facing 5 years in prison and complete social exile. Edmund's reaction was more defiant, but equally futile. Through his lawyer, he announced plans to appeal the judgment and claimed that he was the victim of a conspiracy between his brother's vengeful widow and corrupt court officials. But his appeals fell on deaf ears. The evidence against him was overwhelming. and his public statements only reinforced the image of him as an unrepentant criminal who felt entitled to steal from his own family. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond the Whitmore family. Other Titanic widows began challenging suspicious financial arrangements with their deceased husbands' families. Law enforcement agencies launched investigations into similar cases of fraud. Legal scholars cited the Whitmore case as establishing important precedents for protecting the rights of surviving spouses. More personally, the judgment allowed me to finally lay Charles's memory to rest with honor. His reputation, which Edmund and Victoria had attempted to destroy through their lies about his financial irresponsibility, was completely restored. The court's findings established that Charles had been a brilliant businessman whose success had far exceeded his family's legitimate enterprises. On the evening after the judgment was delivered, I returned to the safe deposit box where this entire journey had begun. I carefully placed Judge Harrison's ruling alongside Charles's diary and his final letter to me, creating a complete record of how justice had finally been served. As I locked the box and walked out of the bank, I realized that Charles had been right about everything. I was stronger than I had known. I had destroyed his family's criminal enterprise completely, and I had honored his memory by ensuring that his love for me had triumphed over their hatred and greed. The Whitmore family's 50-year reign of corruption was over. Their wealth was gone, their reputation was destroyed, and their freedom was forfeit. Justice, as Charles had promised, had finally been served. The brass nameplate outside my law office read Margaret Whitmore, attorney at law specializing in estate fraud and widows' rights. I had it made from the finest materials, with lettering that could be read clearly from across the street. After everything I had endured, I wanted there to be no doubt about who I was and what I did. It had been 6 months since Judge Harrison's final ruling, and I was finally ready to begin the next chapter of my life. The Whitmore family fortune, rightfully restored to me, had made me one of the wealthiest women in Boston. But more importantly, my legal victory had given me a purpose that went far beyond personal revenge. My office occupied the entire third floor of a building on State Street, just 2 blocks from the courthouse where I had destroyed Edmund and Victoria's criminal empire. The location was deliberate. I wanted every corrupt family in Boston to know that justice was within walking distance. The office itself was a testament to both elegance and efficiency. Rich mahogany furniture, floor-to-ceiling law books, and portraits of great legal minds created an atmosphere of serious scholarship. But the centerpiece was Charles's portrait, painted from a photograph taken during our engagement, hanging behind my desk where clients could see it clearly. "He's watching over your work," said my secretary. Mrs. Catherine O'Sullivan, an Irish widow who had lost her husband in an industrial accident and understood the challenges facing women in legal battles. "Yes," I replied, looking at Charles's painted eyes. "He is." My first major case had come to me through Eleanor Caldwell, who had referred another Titanic widow facing family fraud. Within 3 months, I was representing 12 women whose deceased husbands' families had attempted to cheat them out of their inheritances, using tactics similar to what Edmund and Victoria had tried with me. Each case was a variation on the same theme: wealthy families exploiting maritime disasters, industrial accidents, and other tragedies to cover up systematic theft from their own relatives. The pattern was so common that I had developed a standard investigative procedure for uncovering hidden assets and forged documents. "You've become quite famous," O'Brien told me during one of our weekly strategy meetings. He had become my closest legal advisor and trusted friend, helping me navigate the complexities of building a practice while managing my substantial inherited wealth. "Infamous might be a better word," I replied. "Half of Boston's old families cross the street when they see me coming, and the other half, they're potential clients who need help fighting the first half." The success of my practice had exceeded even my own ambitious expectations. Word had spread throughout New England about the lawyer who had destroyed the Whitmore family's criminal enterprise. Women facing similar situations sought me out from as far away as New York and Philadelphia. But my work wasn't limited to individual cases. I had also begun lobbying for legal reforms to protect widows and other vulnerable family members from inheritance fraud. The Whitmore Act, as newspapers had dubbed my proposed legislation, would require full financial disclosure during estate proceedings and impose severe criminal penalties for concealing assets from legal heirs. "You're changing the entire legal landscape," Judge Harrison had told me during a recent social function. Other states are already considering similar legislation based on your proposals. The personal satisfaction of this work was immense, but it couldn't completely fill the void left by Charles's death. In quiet moments, usually late at night in my office when the city was asleep, I still felt the profound loneliness of his absence. Yet I had also discovered something unexpected. My grief had transformed into a source of strength rather than weakness. Every case I won, every corrupt family I exposed, every widow I helped, it all felt like a continuation of the conversation Charles and I had begun during our brief marriage about justice, fairness, and using privilege to help those with less power. Edmund and Victoria had begun serving their prison sentences 3 months earlier. According to newspaper reports, they were adjusting poorly to incarceration. Edmund had been placed in solitary confinement after attempting to bribe guards, while Victoria required constant medical supervision due to her ongoing psychological problems. I felt no sympathy for their suffering. They had chosen to build their lives on lies and theft, and they were now facing the consequences of those choices. Justice demanded accountability, not mercy. The Whitmore family name, once synonymous with Boston respectability, had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked greed and family corruption. Social historians were already writing about the case as a symbol of how old money families had lost their moral authority through criminal behavior. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the transformation of the family's former properties into institutions that would benefit the people they had once exploited. The Beacon Hill mansion was now a legal aid clinic, providing free services to working-class families. The Newport estate had become a home for widows and orphans. The industrial holdings were being operated as employee cooperatives that shared profits with their workers. Charles would have approved of these changes. He had always believed that wealth carried moral obligations, and that privilege should be used to help those less fortunate rather than to exploit them. As I sat in my office that evening, reviewing case files for the next day's hearings, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that terrible night aboard the Titanic. I had lost the love of my life, but I had found my life's work. I had suffered betrayal and attempted theft, but I had discovered reserves of strength and determination I never knew I possessed. Most importantly, I had honored Charles's final wishes by fighting his family's corruption with everything I had. His love for me had transcended death, providing the motivation and moral clarity I needed to seek justice for both of us. The brass nameplate outside my office would remain there for the rest of my career, a reminder to everyone, clients, opponents, and myself, that Margaret Whitmore was a woman who had survived the Titanic disaster and emerged from the wreckage stronger than ever. Charles had been right about my strength. I had been right to trust in his love. And together, even separated by death, we had proven that justice could triumph over greed, that truth could overcome lies, and that love could be more powerful than hatred. The Whitmore family's reign of corruption was over. My reign of justice had just begun. Subscribe for more stories of triumph over tragedy. And remember, never underestimate the strength of a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for.